The coach came around the bend too fast, wheels skidding through mud where snowmelt had turned the mountain road into a river of clay, and Caleb Wells was already running before the first horse screamed. He had been up on the ridge above the Skagit crossing, checking a fence line for the horses he meant to bring down before the spring thaw broke the passes wide open, when the sound reached him. Not thunder. He knew thunder. This was the crack of wood splitting and the panicked whinny of a team that had lost its footing, and he was moving downhill through wet cedar and salal before he had finished deciding to move at all. 60 feet below, the Ellensburg stage lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still spinning against the gray sky, and a woman in a gray traveling dress was dragging herself out of the wreckage with blood on her temple and murder in her eyes, cursing the driver who lay stunned nearby with a rope-burned hand and a face gone pale with shock. Caleb reached the wreck with his boots skidding in the same treacherous mud that had brought the coach down, and his first sight of her stopped something in his chest, even as his hands went automatically to the panicked lead horse, catching the bridle before the animal could thrash itself into the ditch water and drown in 18 inches of runoff. "Easy," he said, and it was not clear whether he spoke to the horse or the woman, because both of them had the same wild, cornered look, the same readiness to fight rather than be helped. "I do not need easing," the woman said, proving his guess wrong immediately. "I need this driver to stop bleeding, and I need to know if my crates survived in that order." She was perhaps 26, with dark hair coming loose from its pins and a jaw set hard enough to crack walnuts, and even bleeding from a shallow cut above her eyebrow. She moved like someone taking inventory of a disaster rather than someone lost inside one. Caleb had spent 11 years in these mountains breeding and gentling horses that other men called ruined, and he had learned to read fear in the set of a shoulder, the flare of a nostril, the particular stillness that came right before a bolt. This woman was afraid. He could see that much in the way her hands shook even as she worked, but she had folded the fear down into something usable, the way a good horse could be taught to carry its terror as alertness instead of panic. "Copper crates," he said, looking past her to where several long wooden boxes had spilled from the coach's rear boot and lay half sunk in ditch mud, and he saw now the telltale gleam of tubing where one crate had split open. "You are hauling a still." "I am hauling the pieces of a still," she corrected, kneeling beside the driver and pressing her own shawl against a gash on his scalp with hands that did not fumble despite their trembling. "Newly commissioned parts, coming up from Seattle by way of the Snoqualmie Road, because the man I answer to decided the mountain crossing would save 2 days over the water route. He did not account for February deciding to behave like April." "Nobody accounts for that," Caleb said, finally getting the lead horse calm enough to stand still, and he tied it off to a cedar sapling before moving to check the second horse, which had gone down hard and was struggling against its own harness. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times, cutting the tangled leather away with the knife from his belt, murmuring low words that were not quite sentences, until the animal's heaving sides slowed and its ears came forward instead of pinned flat with fear. The woman watched him work between attending to the driver, and something in her expression shifted from wary assessment to something closer to surprise. "You have a way with them," she said. "They are not so different from people," Caleb answered, not looking up from the horse's legs, which he was running his hands down to check for breaks. "Scared of the wrong things, brave about the wrong things, and mostly just wanting someone to tell them the truth about what is happening. That is a strange philosophy for a man who lives up a mountain." "I did not say I lived among people," he said, and something in his voice made her almost smile despite the blood at her temple and the ruined coach behind her. The driver, a wiry man named Foss who worked the Snoqualmie run twice weekly, was concussed but conscious, and between the three of them they got him settled against a fallen log with his legs elevated and Caleb's own wool coat over his chest. The horses, Caleb determined, had escaped serious injury, bruised and shaken, but sound enough to walk once freed entirely from the wreckage. The coach itself was a broken thing, one wheel shattered beyond repair, the axle bent, and it would need a Wainwright and a team of mules to haul it back to any town worth the name. "My name is Helen Lawson," the woman said, once the immediate crisis had settled into the slower work of assessment, and she held out a hand streaked with mud and Foss's blood as though she expected Caleb to shake it the way he would shake a man's hand, which he did, finding her grip surprisingly strong. "Caleb Wells," he said. "I breed horses up past the ridge when the weather lets me. Sounds like you are bound for a still site somewhere further up the valley." "Discovery Creek," she said, "though at this rate I may arrive by summer instead of by the week's end. I am not the distiller myself, understand, though most men I meet assume a woman handling copper parts must be someone's wife or daughter running an errand. I keep the books for Ambrose Tanner, who owns 3/4 of the whiskey trade moving through this district, and who sent me a loan because he trusts no one else to verify the crates matched the invoice, and because he did not think the weather would turn as it has." There was something in the way she said Ambrose Tanner's name, a flatness that suggested more history than the words themselves carried, but Caleb did not press. He had learned that people revealed themselves at their own pace, same as spooked horses, and pushing too hard only drove the truth further into hiding. "Discovery Creek is another 8 miles up, past 2 crossings that will be running high with this melt," he said instead. "You will not make it with a broken coach and an injured driver, not before dark, and I would not trust either crossing after dark regardless of your condition." "Then what do you propose, Mr. Wells?" "That I sit in this ditch until spring. I propose you and Foss come to my place tonight, which is closer than any town, and that we sort the rest of this in daylight, when the water has had a chance to drop and my hands have had a chance to warm." Helen studied him for a long moment, taking in the breadth of his shoulders beneath a coat gone dark with mud and rain, the length of hair that had escaped its leather tie to hang damp against his collar, the calm steadiness of pale eyes that had not once looked at her, the way most men looked at a woman alone on a mountain road. She made her decision the way he suspected she made most decisions, quickly and with her eyes open. "Foss cannot walk 8 miles, let alone stumble up whatever trail leads to your place," she said, "and I will not leave those crates unattended for wolves or thieves to pick apart, not after I have already lost half a day's travel to a broken axle. There is a barn empty enough for the crates, and a horse strong enough to carry Foss," Caleb said. "As for you, Miss Lawson, I expect you can walk as far as anyone, given how you have handled the last hour." It was not quite a compliment and not quite a challenge, but Helen felt the shape of respect inside it, and something in her chest loosened slightly. Some tension she had been carrying since Seattle, since long before Seattle if she was honest with herself. They spent the next hour transferring what could be salvaged from the wreck into makeshift packs and slings, and Caleb rigged a travois from cedar branches and rope to drag the heaviest crate, the one containing the copper stillhead itself, dented from the crash but by Helen's careful inspection not beyond repair. Foss was hoisted onto the back of Caleb's own horse, a broad-chested bay gelding named Samson that Caleb had brought down from his place that morning, and the 2 remaining coach horses were led behind, still favoring bruised legs but walking sound enough. The trail up to Caleb's homestead climbed through cedar and hemlock so thick the daylight came down in broken pieces, and Helen walked beside him with her skirts hitched practically above her boot tops, uncaring of propriety in a way that told Caleb she had spent time in places where propriety mattered less than survival. "You are not what I expected of a mountain man," she said, breaking a silence that had stretched comfortably for perhaps a 1/4 mile. "What did you expect? Someone who talks to himself and smells of bear grease and has not seen a woman in a decade." Caleb laughed, a low sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "I have seen women, just not many I wanted to keep seeing. And do you want to keep seeing me, Mr. Wells?" The question hung in the wet mountain air between them, more forward than either of them had quite intended, and Helen felt heat rise in her face despite the cold. "Ask me again once your still is running and your books are balanced," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice that told her the answer was already yes, even if he was too careful a man to say so before he knew what kind of woman she truly was. The homestead, when they reached it as the light was failing, sat in a clearing that Caleb had carved from the forest himself, a solid cabin with a stone chimney, a barn larger than the house, and a corral where several horses moved with the loose, easy gait of animals who trusted the hand that fed them. Helen took in the sight of it with an accountant's eye, noting the good repair of every fence rail, the neatness of stacked firewood, the evidence of a man who built things to last rather than merely to serve. They settled Foss inside near the fire, and Caleb's assessment of the man's injury, a mild concussion and a wrenched shoulder, matched Helen's own, gleaned from tending her late father through worse. The copper crates were stored dry in the barn, and by the time full dark fell over the clearing, Helen found herself seated at Caleb's own table, eating stew he had made from dried venison and winter vegetables, watching firelight move across features that grew more striking the longer she looked at them, the strong line of his jaw shadowed with a day's growth of beard, the corded muscle of his forearms visible where he had rolled his sleeves back to wash the mud from his hands. "Tell me about this still you are guarding," Caleb said, once Foss had drifted into an exhausted sleep near the hearth. "Discovery Creek is a strange place for a distillery. No road worth the name, no easy way to market unless you count the ferry crossing at Marsh Bend, and that crossing has been unreliable since autumn." "Unreliable is a generous word," Helen said, and something tightened at the corners of her mouth. "The Marsh Bend ferry has broken down 3 times since November, always at moments convenient for someone other than the people trying to use it. Ambrose Tanner built the Discovery Creek still specifically because the land was cheap, on account of the access troubles, and he has been paying men to guard the equipment because he fears rivals will sabotage it before it produces a single barrel worth selling." "And you believe him? About the rivals?" Helen was quiet for a moment, turning her spoon slowly through the last of her stew. "I believe the ledgers I keep for him tell a story he has not told me. I believe the money moving through his accounts does not match the whiskey moving through his warehouses, not by a considerable margin. And I believe a man who owns 3/4 of the trade in this district has more reason than any rival to want a crossing broken, if breaking it drives down land prices and drives out competition." Caleb set down his own spoon, giving her his full attention in a way that made Helen aware of how rarely men had done so, how often she had spoken sense to Ambrose Tanner, and watched his eyes glaze with the particular boredom men reserved for women discussing anything beyond household matters. "You think Tanner is sabotaging his own ferry? I think someone is, and I think Tanner benefits, and I have not yet found proof enough to say more than that without risking my position, or worse." "Then why send you alone to guard his still, in the middle of a mountain, during a false thaw that any fool could see coming?" Helen met his eyes across the table, and for the first time that day something like fear showed plainly on her face, not fear of the mountain or the coach wreck, but fear of a truth she had been circling for weeks without daring to name. "Because I think he means for something to happen to me out here, Mr. Wells. I think he has grown tired of a bookkeeper who asks too many questions about numbers that do not add correctly, and I think stranding me at an isolated still with unreliable men, and an unreliable crossing, is his way of solving that problem without dirtying his own hands." The fire popped in the silence that followed, and Caleb felt something old and protective rise in his chest, the same instinct that made him gentle a frightened horse rather than break it, the same instinct that had sent him running downhill toward a wrecked coach without a moment's hesitation. "Then you will not go to that still alone," he said, and it was not a question. "I did not ask for a protector, Mr. Wells." "No," he agreed, But you have got one regardless, seeing as I am the only man for 8 miles who knows both crossings well enough to get you there alive, and I am not inclined to leave a woman to walk into a trap while I sit up here breeding horses and minding my own business." Helen studied him for a long moment, weighing pride against sense, and sense won, as it usually did with her. "Then I accept your company, Mr. Wells, though I will remind you I am not helpless, and I did not survive 3 years of keeping Ambrose Tanner's books by fainting at the first sign of trouble." "I never took you for a fainter, Miss Lawson," Caleb said, and the warmth in his voice as he said it settled something between them that neither was yet ready to name. They set out at first light the next morning, leaving Foss to rest another day before walking himself down to the nearest settlement to report the wrecked coach, and Caleb rigged a sturdier travois for the remaining crates, while Helen insisted on carrying her own satchel of ledgers and correspondence, the papers that she said held more danger to Ambrose Tanner than any copper still ever could. The first crossing, a shallow ford where the trail met a creek swollen with snowmelt, gave them little trouble, Caleb leading the horses through water that came only to their knees, his hand steady on Helen's elbow when the current tugged at her skirts. But the second crossing, at a place called Marsh Bend, where the trail met the wider waters of a river fed by 3 mountain streams, told a different story entirely. The ferry that should have waited at the near bank was gone, its mooring rope cut clean rather than frayed by weather, and the small shelter that housed the ferryman's tools had been stripped of everything useful, leaving only an overturned lantern and the cold ashes of a fire that had not been tended in days. "This was done on purpose," Caleb said, crouching to examine the cut rope, running his thumb over the clean edge where a knife had sliced through fibers that should have taken an axe to sever. "No accident leaves a rope cut this neat." "How far to the next crossing?" Helen asked, already scanning the swollen river with the eyes of someone calculating distances and dangers rather than despairing over them. 6 miles downstream, and that crossing is a footbridge that may not hold this water level regardless." Caleb stood, studying the far bank where he could just make out the shape of a cabin through the cedars, smoke rising thin from its chimney. "Someone lives across there. If the ferryman has not fled entirely, we might raise him with enough shouting, or enough patience." They spent the better part of an hour calling across the water and building a fire large enough to signal intent rather than distress, until finally a figure emerged from the far cabin, an old man moving with the careful gait of someone nursing old injuries, who called back that the ferry had been stolen 3 nights past by men he did not recognize, riding for Tanner's outfit if the brand on their horses meant anything. "There is a raft," the old man shouted, his voice carrying thin across the water, "built for hauling timber, tied up around the bend where the current runs slower. It will hold weight, but it will not steer easy against this flood." Caleb thanked him and turned to Helen, his jaw set with the particular calm he brought to difficult decisions. "We can wait for the water to drop, which may take days this time of year, or we can risk the raft." "Tanner's men cut this ferry loose to keep help from reaching the still," Helen said, working through the logic even as fear tightened in her chest. "Which means whoever is guarding the still now is guarding it alone, without supply, without relief, exactly as you said this crossing was designed to accomplish. You know someone out there." "Ambrose sent a distiller ahead of me, a man named Josiah Pratt, 3 weeks past, to assemble the still and begin the first mash while I brought the remaining equipment and settled the accounts. If the crossing has been broken since before I left Seattle, Pratt has been alone out there far longer than anyone intended." The image that rose in Caleb's mind, a man alone at an isolated still with a failing mash and no relief in sight, mountain rain wearing away at both equipment and resolve, moved something in him beyond mere duty. He had spent enough years alone himself to know what isolation could do to a person's judgment, how it could turn caution into recklessness or patience into despair. "Then we take the raft," he said, "and we take it now before the water rises further with today's melt." The raft, when they found it, was a rough platform of lashed logs meant for hauling cut timber downstream rather than ferrying passengers against a current. And Caleb spent 20 minutes reinforcing its lashings, while Helen held the horses steady on the near bank, speaking to them in low tones she had picked up simply from watching Caleb the day before, and finding to her surprise that the animals responded, ears coming forward, tension easing from their shoulders. "You are a fast study," Caleb said, glancing up from his work to watch her calm the bay gelding with nothing more than a steady voice and an outstretched palm. "I have spent 3 years learning to read Ambrose Tanner's moods before he speaks a word, to know when a ledger error will provoke a shrug or a shouted accusation. Horses seem simpler than that." "Most things are simpler than a dishonest man," Caleb agreed, and something in the shared look between them carried an understanding that went beyond the immediate danger, a recognition of two people who had each learned to survive by reading the world more carefully than those around them. They loaded the crates first, lashing them tight to the raft's center, then led the horses onto the unsteady platform one at a time, Caleb's hands never leaving the lead rope, his voice a constant low murmur that kept each animal calm even as the logs shifted and settled beneath new weight. Helen positioned herself at the rear with a long pole cut from a sapling, ready to help fend off obstacles, and when Caleb glanced back to check her readiness, he found her expression fierce with concentration rather than fear. The crossing itself lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, the current catching the raft and dragging it downstream, even as Caleb worked a second pole against the push of water, muscles standing out along his forearms and shoulders as he fought to keep them angled toward the far bank rather than sweeping past it entirely. Twice the raft struck submerged debris hard enough to jolt every board, and once Helen lost her footing entirely, catching herself against a crate with a gasp that brought Caleb's eyes to her instantly, some fierce protectiveness flaring in his expression even as he kept both poles working, unwilling to abandon the labor that was keeping them all alive. "I am well," she called before he could ask, already regaining her balance and her pole, and something in her steadiness, her refusal to become a burden even in genuine danger, settled a warmth in Caleb's chest that had nothing to do with the exertion warming his muscles. They reached the far bank with the horses trembling but unhurt, the crates soaked but intact, and Caleb collapsed briefly onto the mud of the shore, breathing hard, before Helen extended a hand to help him up, a small gesture that carried more weight than either of them acknowledged aloud. "Thank you," she said, and he understood she meant more than the crossing itself. "We are not done yet," he said, though his voice was gentler than the words suggested. "Discovery Creek is another 3 miles from here, and if Pratt has been alone as long as we suspect, we may find more trouble waiting than a broken still." The trail to Discovery Creek wound through terrain that grew steadily wilder, the cedar forest giving way to steeper slopes where recent slides had torn raw gashes through the hillside, evidence of the same false thaw that had overturned Helen's coach the day before. Twice they had to detour around washouts that had swallowed the original trail entirely, Caleb reading the land with an ease that spoke of years spent traveling these mountains, until finally the trees opened onto a small clearing beside the rushing creek, and Helen's breath caught at what she saw there. The still sat exactly as expected, a rough shed built around the copper apparatus that had not yet arrived to complete it, but the fire beneath the existing kettle had burned down to embers, and the mash inside had begun to sour, a sharp, wrong smell carrying across the clearing. More alarming still was the figure slumped against the shed wall, a thin man with several days' growth of beard and hollow eyes that spoke of exhaustion beyond mere sleeplessness. A shotgun laid across his knees, though his grip on it looked barely conscious. "Pratt," Helen called, hurrying forward, and the man's head jerked up, the shotgun rising halfway before recognition crossed his face, and the weapon dropped back down with a clatter of relief. "Miss Lawson," he rasped, his voice cracked from disuse or dehydration. I had begun to think no one was coming at all. The ferryman never returned, and I have had nothing but jerky and creek water for 6 days, guarding equipment I cannot even use without the parts you were meant to bring. We brought them, Helen said, already moving to check his condition, pressing a canteen into his shaking hands. Though the road here nearly killed us both, and I begin to think that was rather the point. Caleb, meanwhile, had moved to examine the still itself, running experienced hands over the existing copper, noting the dents and the improper seating of what fittings had already been assembled. Though he was no distiller by trade, he had spent years repairing farm equipment and tack in isolation, learning through necessity the particular satisfaction of coaxing broken things back into working order, and he recognized immediately that the still's failure was not merely a matter of missing parts. "This has been sabotaged," he said, drawing Helen's attention from Pratt's shaking hands. "Look here, where the worm should connect to the condenser. Someone has bent this fitting deliberately, and recently, judging by the fresh scrape marks." Pratt's exhausted eyes widened with a fear that went beyond mere hunger or cold. "2 nights passed," he said slowly, memory surfacing through his depletion. "I heard something in the dark, thought it was a bear rooting through the supplies, but come morning I found the still fittings bent just as you describe. I thought perhaps I had done it myself in my exhaustion, working too hard trying to make repairs I did not understand." "You did not do this," Caleb said firmly. "This is the work of someone who understands metalwork well enough to know exactly where to strike for maximum damage with minimum effort. Someone came here in the dark, damaged your equipment, and left you to believe it was your own failing." Helen's face had gone hard with a fury that transformed her features, stripping away exhaustion to reveal something fierce and determined beneath. "Tanner's men," she said. "The same ones who cut the ferry loose. They meant to strand Pratt here with equipment he could not use, to prove the Discovery Creek operation was a failure, perhaps to justify selling the land cheap to whatever buyer Tanner has already arranged. You believe your employer means to fail this deliberately. I believe my employer means to control both the failure and the recovery, Mr. Wells, to buy up ruined operations cheap once their original owners despair, and to do so while appearing entirely blameless. It is a pattern I have watched in his ledgers for months without proof enough to act. But this," she gestured at the sabotaged fittings, "this is proof I can hold in my hands." Caleb studied the bent copper for a long moment, his mind already working through the problem the way he approached a horse with a dangerous habit, looking not merely at the symptom, but at what had caused it and what might correct it. "I can fix this," he said finally. "Not tonight, the light is failing and Pratt needs food and rest before anything else, but by morning, if we work through the dark hours, I believe this copper can be repaired well enough to run a proper mash. I have worked metal before, tack and farm tools mostly, but copper bends the same as iron if you know where to apply heat and where to apply patience." Pratt looked between them with something like disbelief. "You would spend a night working to save equipment that belongs to a man who tried to ruin me." "I would spend a night proving that sabotage does not have to win," Caleb said simply. "And because Miss Lawson tells me this still, if it succeeds honestly, might be the first proof strong enough to expose a man who has been robbing this district blind for longer than anyone has dared name aloud." They settled Pratt near a fire that Helen built with the efficient competence of someone who had spent time in rough conditions before, feeding him broth from their remaining supplies, while Caleb began his examination of the still in earnest, laying out tools he had brought in his own pack, a small forge hammer, files, and lengths of wire that could serve a dozen improvised purposes. As full darkness settled over Discovery Creek, Helen found herself drawn to the small fire Caleb built beside the still itself, close enough to provide light for his work, but far enough to avoid sparking any remaining vapors from the soured mash. She watched him work with the same fascination she had felt watching him calm the frightened horses, The way his large hands moved with unexpected delicacy over the copper fittings, testing each seam, each joint, with the careful attention of a man who respected the material he worked rather than forcing it. "You said you were no distiller," she said, settling beside him with a mug of coffee she had brewed from their dwindling supplies. "Yet you handle that copper like you have done this work before." "I have not," Caleb admitted, not looking up from where he was carefully heating a section of bent tubing over a small portable brazier. "But copper is copper, whether it is shaping a whiskey worm or repairing a bent horseshoe. The metal tells you what it needs if you listen rather than force. Bend it too fast and it cracks. Bend it too slow and you waste the heat before the shape holds. That sounds like something you would say about a horse." "Most things worth doing well require the same patience," he said, and finally looked up at her, firelight catching the strong planes of his face, the intensity of eyes that had watched her all day with something that had grown warmer with each shared danger. "You did not run today, Miss Lawson. Not from the coach wreck, not from the river crossing, not from learning your employer may want you dead. Most people I have known would have broken somewhere in that list." "I have had considerable practice not breaking," Helen said, and there was old pain beneath the words that made Caleb set down his tools entirely, giving her his full attention. "My father died 4 years ago, leaving debts I did not know existed until the creditors came calling. Ambrose Tanner offered to settle those debts in exchange for my services as his bookkeeper, and I accepted because the alternative was watching my father's name dragged through every court in Seattle. I have spent 3 years grateful for that rescue, Mr. Wells, before I understood the debt he settled was smaller than the profit he has made from my labor since, and smaller still than the danger he seems willing to let me walk into now that I have grown inconvenient." "That is not gratitude you owe him," Caleb said, his voice rough with an anger that surprised her with its intensity. "That is a debt he has already collected 100 times over, and if he has sent you here hoping the mountain would finish what his ledgers began, then he has made an enemy of me as surely as he has made one of you." Helen studied his face in the firelight, the fierce protectiveness there tempered by something gentler, something that had been building between them since the coach wreck through every shared danger and quiet conversation since. "I did not ask for a protector, Mr. Wells," she said again, softer this time than she had said it before. "I know," he answered. "I am not offering to protect you because you need it, Miss Lawson. I am offering because I find I would rather stand beside you facing this trouble than watch it from a distance, and because a woman who walks toward danger with her eyes open rather than her hands wringing is not a woman I have met before, and I find I do not wish to stop meeting her now that I have started." The words hung between them, honest in a way that neither of them had quite intended to be so soon, and Helen felt something in her chest that she had not felt in years, not since before her father's death had taught her that trust was a luxury she could not always afford. "Finish your copper, Mr. Wells," she said finally, though warmth colored her voice rather than dismissal. "We can discuss what we find and what we wish to keep meeting, once Pratt still is running, and this district's thieves have been properly exposed." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed the serious lines of his face, and returned to his work with renewed focus, while Helen sat beside him through the long hours of the night, sometimes helping to hold pieces steady, sometimes simply keeping the fire fed and the coffee warm, watching a man's hands work miracles from bent copper, with a patience that spoke of a heart far gentler than his considerable strength would suggest to a stranger. The work stretched through the deepest hours of night, Caleb's forge hammer tapping soft rhythms against copper that slowly yielded to his patient corrections, each bent section straightened, each damaged joint refitted, while Pratt slept fitfully near the main fire and Helen kept careful watch over both the mountain darkness and the man working beside her with such quiet dedication. Near what she judged to be 3 in the morning, Caleb paused in his work, flexing hands that had grown stiff from hours of careful labor, and Helen noticed for the first time a shallow gash along his forearm, likely torn during the raft crossing hours before, that had gone unattended in the urgency of reaching Discovery Creek. "You are hurt," she said, reaching for his arm before he could deflect the observation. "It is nothing," he said, though he did not pull away from her examination. "A scratch from the crossing, hardly worth mentioning against a whole night's work still ahead. It will fester if left uncleaned, and you will be considerably less useful to Pratt still with a fevered arm than with a scratch properly tended." Helen's tone carried the same practical firmness she might have used balancing a difficult ledger, and Caleb found himself surrendering to her care with an ease that surprised him. A man who had spent years tending his own injuries alone, now allowing this fierce, capable woman to clean his wound with water warmed over the fire, and a strip of clean cloth torn from her own petticoat. Her hands were gentle as they worked, despite their evident strength, and Caleb watched her face in the firelight as she concentrated on the task, noting the same careful attention she had shown the frightened horses the day before, the same patience she brought to every problem she encountered. "You have done this before," he said. "My father was often injured in his trading work, careless with his hands even as he was careful with his numbers. I learned to tend wounds before I learned to keep ledgers, though both skills have served me considerably since his death." She tied off the bandage with practiced efficiency, then looked up to find Caleb watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded in his pale eyes that she had not seen from him before. "Helen," he said, using her given name for the first time, and the sound of it in his low voice sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. "I have spent 11 years alone on this mountain, telling myself the company of horses was enough, that I did not need the complications a woman might bring into my quiet life. I find, meeting you, that I have been telling myself a lie for longer than I care to admit." "Caleb," she answered, matching his use of given names, and something in the simple exchange felt more intimate than any embrace might have been. "I have spent 3 years telling myself that survival was enough, that trust was a luxury I could not afford after watching my father's misplaced faith destroy everything he built. I find, meeting you, that perhaps survival was never meant to be the whole of a life." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them, though the pull toward doing so hung thick in the mountain air, both understanding without words that the danger surrounding them, Tanner's sabotage, the still yet unrepaired, Pratt's exhausted vulnerability nearby, demanded their full attention before anything more personal could safely unfold. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, an acknowledgement made and accepted, a door opened that neither intended to close again. Caleb returned to his work with renewed energy, and by the time gray light began filtering through the cedars, announcing dawn's approach, the copper still stood repaired, every joint sound, every fitting properly seated, ready to run a mash that would prove or disprove Ambrose Tanner's claims about Discovery Creek's viability. Pratt woke to find his equipment transformed, and tears actually gathered in the exhausted man's eyes as he examined Caleb's work with hands that trembled from more than mere hunger now. "This is better than new," he said, his voice thick with emotion and disbelief. "I have worked stills for 15 years, Mr. Wells, and I have never seen copper repaired with such care. You have saved not merely equipment but my livelihood, and perhaps my life, for I do not know how much longer I could have survived alone out here with Tanner's men circling like wolves waiting for me to simply give up and walk away." "Thank Miss Lawson as much as me," Caleb said, glancing toward Helen with warmth that made Pratt's eyebrows rise with sudden understanding. "She is the one who recognized this sabotage for what it was rather than accepting Tanner's likely explanation of simple mountain misfortune." They fired the repaired still as the sun cleared the eastern ridges, and within 2 hours the first clean vapor began condensing through Caleb's careful repairs, a thin stream of clear spirit that Pratt tasted with the reverent attention of a craftsman confirming his life's work had not been in vain. "It runs true," he said, wonder coloring his exhausted voice. "Whatever Tanner intended by breaking this equipment and cutting us off from relief, he has failed, thanks to the two of you." But even as they celebrated this small victory, Helen's mind was already working toward larger concerns, and she drew Caleb aside while Pratt tended his newly functioning still with the devoted attention of a man reunited with lost purpose. "This proves sabotage occurred," she said quietly, "but it does not yet prove Tanner ordered it, nor does it address the deeper theft I have suspected in his ledgers for months. If we mean to expose him properly, we need more than a bent piece of copper and a cut ferry rope. What would satisfy the proof you need? His account books, the true ones, not the copies he shows to partners and investors. I have suspected for months that he keeps a second set of records, hidden somewhere at his Seattle office, that would show the true profits he has extracted from operations like this one, while claiming losses to justify buying out struggling partners at prices far below actual value. You believe Discovery Creek is not the first operation he has sabotaged this way. I believe it is perhaps the fifth or sixth, Caleb, going back nearly 2 years, each time following the same pattern. A remote operation, difficult access, mysterious equipment failures or transportation disruptions, followed by Tanner's generous offer to purchase the failing venture at a fraction of its worth, after which the operation mysteriously recovers under his direct management. I have watched this pattern in his books without daring to name it, telling myself I was imagining connections that did not truly exist. But you no longer believe that. I no longer have the luxury of doubt, not after watching you repair copper that someone deliberately damaged to strand a man alone in these mountains, until desperation forced him to abandon everything he had built. Caleb studied her face, seeing the fierce determination there that had drawn him to her from their first meeting beside the wrecked coach, and felt something protective and admiring rise together in his chest. "Then we find those true ledgers," he said, "and we bring this theft into the light where every honest person in this district can see it plainly. That will not be simple. Tanner keeps his private office locked, and even if I could access it, removing evidence without his knowledge would be difficult, particularly now that he likely suspects I have grown too curious about his numbers." "There is another way," Caleb said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "Tanner means to expand his holdings in this district, does he not? You mentioned an auction, land he intends to acquire once operations like this one fail properly. There is a land auction scheduled in 3 weeks at the county seat in Fairhaven for several parcels along the Discovery Creek watershed and the Marsh Bend crossing itself, properties Tanner has been maneuvering to acquire cheap through exactly this pattern of manufactured failure." "Then that auction is where we expose him," Caleb said, "publicly, where witnesses cannot be silenced or bought, where whatever documents you can gather will do the most damage to his reputation and his purchases both." The plan, once spoken aloud, felt both audacious and exactly right, and Helen felt something kindle in her chest that had been dormant since her father's death, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, a chance to correct an injustice she had watched unfold for months while feeling powerless to act alone. They spent the following days at Discovery Creek, helping Pratt establish a proper production rhythm for the still, Caleb's steady presence proving invaluable not merely for his metalwork skills, but for his understanding of the practical challenges facing an isolated operation, while Helen began the careful work of documenting everything they had discovered: the sabotaged ferry, the damaged steel fittings, the timeline that connected Tanner's business decisions to a pattern of manufactured crisis that stretched back further than even she had initially suspected. During these days, their relationship deepened through countless small moments that built trust more surely than any grand declaration might have accomplished. Caleb taught Helen to read the moods of Pratt's mule, an animal that had grown skittish from the isolation and stress of recent weeks, showing her how patient attention could calm even a badly frightened creature, and Helen found herself fascinated by his gentle competence, the way strength and tenderness combined so naturally in his large hands. In turn, Helen showed Caleb the intricate patterns hidden within Tanner's ledgers, teaching him to read the language of numbers that told stories most people never learned to see. And Caleb found himself admiring the sharp precision of her mind as much as he admired the courage she had shown facing every danger the mountain had presented. One evening, as they worked together documenting evidence by lamplight while Pratt tended the still steady operation outside, Helen paused in her careful notation to study Caleb's profile, the strong lines of his face softened by concentration as he helped organize papers according to dates and locations. "May I ask you something personal, Caleb?" "You may ask me anything," he said, looking up with an openness that had grown between them through shared danger and quiet trust. "Why have you remained alone all these years? A man of your evident capability, your gentleness, your strength, could surely have found companionship in any of the settlements within reach." Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with the same care he brought to gentling a difficult horse. "My mother died when I was young, and my father raised me alone in country not so different from this, teaching me that horses were more trustworthy than most people, that a man could build a good life through honest work and careful attention without needing the complications that came from trusting others too deeply. I believed him for a long time, Helen, believed that solitude was simply the price of peace. And now I have watched a woman face a coach wreck, a swollen river, a mountain of danger, and a betrayal from someone she trusted, without once losing the steadiness that makes her remarkable, and I find myself wondering if perhaps my father's peace was simply another word for loneliness, and if perhaps there is a different kind of peace available to a man brave enough to trust someone worthy of that trust." Helen felt tears gather unexpectedly at his honesty, and she reached across the small table to cover his hand with hers, feeling the callous strength of fingers that had gentled countless frightened animals now resting still and warm beneath her touch. "I have spent 3 years believing trust was a luxury that led only to betrayal," she said, "watching my father's generous nature exploited by men who saw kindness as weakness, watching Ambrose Tanner exploit my own gratitude for his supposed rescue. But you have shown me nothing but honest strength since the moment you came running down that mountainside, Caleb Wells, and I find I no longer wish to protect myself from the possibility of trusting someone who has earned it so thoroughly." Their hands remained joined across the small table, firelight catching the moment in warm amber light, and this time neither of them hesitated when Caleb leaned forward, closing the distance between them with a gentleness that belied his obvious strength, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that carried the weight of everything they had survived together, and everything they hoped might yet unfold between them. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Helen found herself smiling in a way that felt unfamiliar after years of careful guardedness. "That was considerably overdue, Mr. Wells. I have found, Miss Lawson, that the best repairs, whether to copper or to a person's guarded heart, require exactly the right amount of patience, applied at exactly the right moment." They remained at Discovery Creek 5 more days, ensuring Pratt still ran smoothly and gathering additional evidence from the ferryman across the river, who confirmed under careful questioning that the men who had stolen his ferry had indeed ridden horses bearing Tanner's distinctive brand, evidence that Helen carefully documented alongside everything else they had gathered. When they finally departed for Fairhaven, where the land auction would take place in less than 2 weeks, they traveled together with a growing sense of partnership that extended beyond mere romantic attachment into something closer to shared purpose. Two people who had found in each other not merely affection, but genuine respect for the other's capabilities. The journey to Fairhaven required nearly 4 days of careful travel, avoiding the still unreliable mountain roads in favor of a longer route that followed the more stable lowland trails. And during this journey, Helen shared with Caleb the full extent of what she had documented in Tanner's ledgers over the previous months, patterns of falsified expenses, mysteriously vanished profits, and a network of associates who had each benefited from properties acquired through circumstances remarkably similar to what they had witnessed at Discovery Creek. "There is a man named Silas Whitmore," Helen explained one evening as they camped beside a stream running clear and calm compared to the flooded mountain waters they had crossed earlier, "who serves as the county land registrar in Fairhaven. I have found his signature on 3 separate transfers that match this pattern of manufactured failure followed by suspiciously convenient purchase. I believe he may be working directly with Tanner, perhaps falsifying auction records or steering bidding toward Tanner's interests. That would explain how Tanner has managed such consistent success acquiring properties others might have contested. It would also mean the auction itself may be compromised before it even begins, unless we can find proof of Whitmore's involvement strong enough to prevent his interference." Caleb considered this as he tended their small fire, the flames casting warm light across features that Helen had grown to find endlessly compelling, strength and gentleness combined in ways she had never expected to find in any man. "What if the proof already exists?" he said slowly, "not in Tanner's private ledgers alone, but in the county's own records. If Whitmore has falsified auction results before, there should be some trace of that falsification in the official documents themselves, discrepancies between recorded bids and actual payment amounts, or properties transferred without proper public notice as required by territorial law. You think we should examine the county records directly, rather than relying solely on Tanner's private books? I think 2 sources of proof are stronger than one, particularly when one source comes from the very office that would otherwise help Tanner hide his crimes." This insight led them, upon reaching Fairhaven 2 days later, to spend careful hours reviewing public land records at the county courthouse. Helen's trained eye for numerical discrepancy proving invaluable as she cross-referenced auction dates, recorded bid amounts, and final transfer prices against the private ledger information she had already gathered from Tanner's Seattle office during her years managing his accounts. The pattern, once fully assembled, painted a damning picture that extended well beyond Discovery Creek, implicating not merely Tanner's manufactured crises, but Whitmore's active participation in falsifying the public record to support those crimes. They also learned, through careful inquiry among Fairhaven's merchants and settlers, that Tanner had grown increasingly concerned about Helen's continued absence, having sent inquiries to Discovery Creek that returned no answer once Pratt, at Caleb's suggestion, had begun deflecting messengers with vague reports of continued equipment troubles that kept Tanner believing his sabotage remained effective. "He believes I am still stranded at Discovery Creek, perhaps even believes I have abandoned my post there entirely," Helen said, satisfaction coloring her voice as they reviewed their gathered evidence the night before the scheduled auction. "That confidence will make our appearance at tomorrow's proceedings considerably more effective, particularly if he has not prepared any defense against my presence. Are you certain you wish to confront him publicly? There would be less risk in simply presenting this evidence to territorial authorities privately, letting legal process unfold at its own pace." Helen met his concerned gaze with the same fierce determination that had first drawn Caleb to her beside the wrecked coach nearly 3 weeks before. "Legal process moves slowly, Caleb, and slowly enough that Tanner could complete tomorrow's purchases before any investigation concludes, acquiring properties he has manufactured crises to obtain cheaply. If we mean to stop this theft rather than merely document it after the fact, we must act publicly, decisively, before those transfers become final. Then I will stand beside you when you do." The morning of the auction arrived clear and cold, the kind of bright winter day that often followed the treacherous false thaws that had caused so much trouble throughout the region, and Fairhaven's town square filled early with settlers, merchants, and speculators drawn by the promised sale of several valuable properties along Discovery Creek and the Marsh Bend crossing. Helen dressed carefully that morning in her best remaining traveling clothes, cleaned and pressed as well as circumstances allowed, while Caleb wore a coat he had purchased specifically for this occasion, wanting to present himself as more than simply a mountain horse breeder when they confronted a man of Tanner's supposed respectability. Ambrose Tanner arrived precisely as the auction was scheduled to begin, a heavy-set man in his 50s whose expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted through whatever means necessary. He took his position near the auctioneer's platform with the easy assurance of a man who had already arranged the day's outcome, and Helen felt Caleb's hand find hers briefly, a gesture of support rather than restraint, before she stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Tanner," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "I wonder if you might explain to these gathered bidders why the Discovery Creek properties you intend to purchase today experienced such convenient equipment failures over recent weeks. Failures that I have documented were the result of deliberate sabotage rather than natural misfortune." Tanner's confident expression flickered momentarily before settling back into practiced calm, though Helen, who had spent 3 years learning to read every nuance of his moods, saw the genuine alarm beneath his composure. "Miss Lawson," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing warmth he had always used to dismiss her concerns, "I am relieved to see you survived your journey, though I confess surprise at your dramatic accusations. Perhaps the mountain crossing affected your judgment more than your safety." "My judgment remains entirely intact," Helen replied, drawing from her satchel the carefully organized documents she had gathered over the preceding weeks, "as does my understanding of your account books, which I have managed faithfully for 3 years, and which reveal patterns of manufactured failure and subsequent convenient acquisition that extend to no fewer than 6 separate properties across this district." The crowd had begun murmuring, attention shifting from mere curiosity to genuine interest, as Helen's confident presentation suggested substance behind her accusations rather than mere hysteria. Tanner's composure cracked further, a flush of anger rising above his collar. "These are the ravings of a woman who has clearly suffered some misfortune on the mountain trail, perhaps struck her head in whatever accident delayed her return. I would advise everyone present to disregard such unfounded accusations and proceed with today's legitimate business." "Are they unfounded, Mr. Whitmore?" Helen turned toward the county land registrar, who had gone visibly pale near the auctioneer's platform, and produced a second set of documents. "Perhaps you might explain these discrepancies between the recorded bids at last autumn's Cedar Valley auction and the actual transfer payments recorded in the county's own books, discrepancies that consistently favor Mr. Tanner's interests by amounts that suggest something other than honest competitive bidding." Whitmore's mouth opened and closed several times without producing coherent words, his expression that of a man watching his careful arrangements collapse in real time before an audience he could not control. "This is absurd," Tanner said, his voice rising with genuine anger now rather than mere performance. "I will not stand here and be slandered by a woman I generously employed despite her limited understanding of business affairs, a woman who apparently allowed some mountain man," his eyes flicked dismissively toward Caleb, "to fill her head with wild accusations during whatever misadventure delayed her return." Caleb stepped forward then, his considerable presence drawing every eye in the crowd, the breadth of his shoulders and the quiet confidence of his bearing commanding attention even before he spoke. "I found Miss Lawson's coach overturned on the mountain road, Mr. Tanner, victim of conditions any responsible employer should have anticipated before sending a lone woman through such treacherous terrain in February. I also found your Discovery Creek still deliberately sabotaged, its equipment damaged by hands that understood exactly where to strike for maximum effect, and I found your ferryman's rope cut clean by a blade rather than worn by weather. The same convenient misfortune that has apparently plagued no fewer than 6 of your business ventures over the past 2 years. You have no proof of any such connection, Tanner said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. I have Miss Lawson's 3 years of careful bookkeeping, Caleb replied, which apparently understood your true finances better than you believed possible, and I have witnesses at Discovery Creek and Marsh Bend who can testify to men bearing your brand committing the sabotage in question. The crowd's murmurs had grown considerably louder now, several faces turning toward Tanner with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility, particularly among the smaller landholders and merchants who had watched their own operations struggle while Tanner's holdings mysteriously prospered. I demand these accusations be properly investigated through legal channels, Tanner said, attempting to regain some measure of control over the deteriorating situation, rather than aired as public spectacle designed merely to embarrass me before my peers. I agree entirely that proper investigation is warranted, said a new voice, and the crowd parted to reveal Judge Harmon Cole, the territorial circuit judge who had arrived in Fairhaven that morning to oversee the auction's legal proceedings, having been alerted days earlier by a letter Helen had sent ahead through a trusted courier, arranging for exactly this kind of official presence should their public confrontation require immediate legal authority. Miss Lawson's letter reached me 3 days past, Mr. Tanner, along with copies of several concerning documents that I have reviewed with considerable interest. Given the serious nature of these allegations, I am suspending today's auction pending full investigation of the properties in question and the circumstances surrounding their previous operational difficulties. Tanner's face had gone from red to ashen as the true scope of his exposure became clear, the careful arrangement he had constructed over 2 years collapsing in a single morning's public reckoning. "This is preposterous," he said, though the fight had gone from his voice. "I am a respected businessman with considerable holdings throughout this territory. You are a man who will answer for sabotaged property, falsified public records, and the deliberate endangerment of an employee you sent alone into dangerous conditions with apparent intent to eliminate her scrutiny of your affairs," Judge Cole replied, his tone carrying the weight of legal authority that even Tanner's wealth could not immediately overcome. "I would suggest, Mr. Tanner, that you retain competent counsel, as I intend to pursue these matters with the full seriousness they deserve." The confrontation that followed occupied much of the remaining day, as territorial marshals arrived to take initial statements, and Judge Cole reviewed the extensive documentation Helen had prepared, while the crowd slowly dispersed with the particular satisfaction of people who had witnessed genuine justice unfold before their eyes. Whitmore, faced with the mounting evidence and Tanner's evident abandonment of any pretense of loyalty, ultimately confirmed under questioning that he had indeed falsified several auction records at Tanner's instruction, providing testimony that would prove crucial to the eventual legal proceedings against both men. By evening, as the town settled into the particular quiet that followed dramatic public events, Helen and Caleb found themselves finally alone together in the small hotel room she had secured, both emotionally exhausted from the day's confrontation, but carrying the deep satisfaction of having successfully exposed injustice that had harmed numerous families throughout the district. "You were magnificent today," Caleb said, watching her carefully remove pins from hair that had come loose during the long, tense confrontation. "I have never seen anyone face down a man like Tanner with such composed determination." "I could not have gathered sufficient evidence without your insight about the county records," Helen replied, "nor could I have survived long enough to reach Fairhaven without your protection on that mountain. This victory belongs to both of us, Caleb, as does whatever comes next." "What do you wish to come next, Helen? Now that Tanner's schemes lie exposed and his properties will likely be redistributed through proper legal process. What future do you envision for yourself? Helen crossed the small room to stand before him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his considerable frame, close enough to see the vulnerability beneath his careful question. I find I no longer wish to spend my days managing another person's dishonest ledgers, Caleb, nor do I wish to return to Seattle's crowded streets when I have discovered how alive I feel among these mountains, despite their dangers, or perhaps because of how those dangers led me to you. I find, if I am entirely honest, that I wish to build a life here. In this district, we have helped save from Tanner's corruption, and I find I wish to build that life with you specifically, if you would have me. Helen Lawson, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer attempted to hide. I have spent 11 years believing solitude was the price of peace, that trusting another person too deeply led only to eventual loss and disappointment. You have shown me, through every danger we have faced together, that trust properly placed leads not to loss, but to a strength neither of us could achieve alone. I would be honored beyond words to build that life with you, to have you stand beside me not as someone I protect, but as someone who protects me in turn, as you have already done today, exposing a corruption I could never have documented alone. Their kiss this time carried none of the tentative uncertainty of their first embrace at Discovery Creek, but rather the confident joy of two people who had thoroughly tested their compatibility through genuine crisis, and found it not merely sufficient, but exceptional. When they finally parted, both were smiling with the particular happiness of people who had found something rare and precious amid difficult circumstances. The following weeks brought considerable change to the district, as Judge Cole's investigation expanded to reveal the full extent of Tanner's schemes, ultimately resulting in criminal charges against both Tanner and Whitmore for fraud, sabotage, and the falsification of public records. The properties Tanner had acquired through manufactured crisis were ordered returned to their original owners where possible, or offered at fair market value to legitimate bidders where original owners could not be located. And Discovery Creek still, no longer under threat of sabotage, began producing whiskey that Pratt sold at honest prices to grateful customers throughout the region. Helen found herself in considerable demand as word spread of her role in exposing Tanner's corruption. Several legitimate merchants and landholders seeking her expertise in reviewing their own accounts and ensuring similar schemes had not victimized their operations. Work that paid considerably better than her previous position, and allowed her the satisfaction of applying her considerable skills toward honest purposes. Caleb, meanwhile, found his reputation as a horse breeder enhanced by the district's growing awareness of his role in the Tanner affair. Several ranchers and settlers seeking his expertise not merely for horse breeding, but for his evident skill at solving practical problems through patient, careful attention, skills that had proven equally valuable whether applied to frightened animals or damaged copper stills. 3 weeks after the auction's dramatic interruption, as the mountain weather settled into a more predictable late winter pattern, Caleb and Helen returned together to his homestead, the same clearing where their journey together had begun with a shared meal beside his hearth fire. This time, however, Helen arrived not as a stranded traveler but as someone choosing this place, this life, this man, with the full clarity of someone who understood exactly what she was accepting. "I have been thinking," Caleb said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and rose, "about what kind of life we might build here together, assuming you remain interested in building anything with a mountain man who talks to horses more comfortably than he talks to most people." "I find that particular quality considerably endearing," Helen said, leaning against his shoulder with the easy comfort of someone who had grown thoroughly accustomed to his presence. "What life did you have in mind?" "I have more land than I currently use for horse breeding alone, and I have been considering whether that land might support a small distilling operation as well, honest whiskey produced without the sabotage or corruption that nearly destroyed Pratt's efforts. I would need someone with considerable skill managing accounts and ensuring fair dealing with suppliers and buyers alike. Helen laughed, a sound of genuine delight that had grown more frequent since their arrival at Fairhaven's dramatic auction. You are proposing a business partnership, Caleb Wells. I am proposing considerably more than that, he said, turning to face her fully, his expression serious despite the warmth in his pale eyes. I am proposing a life, Helen, a partnership in every sense the word carries, horses and whiskey, and whatever other honest work we might discover suits us both, built on the same trust we have already proven through danger neither of us anticipated when we met beside that wrecked coach 3 weeks past. I am asking you to marry me, to build this home together not as protector and protected but as equal partners who have already demonstrated, through fire and flood and public confrontation with corruption, that we make each other stronger rather than weaker. Helen felt tears gather at the sincerity in his words, at the vision he described of partnership rather than mere protection, and she answered him with the same directness that had characterized their entire journey together. Yes, Caleb Wells. I will marry you, and I will help you build whatever honest enterprise you envision, and I will spend considerably more years than either of us has yet imagined proving that trust properly placed leads not to loss, but to exactly the kind of strength you described. I love you, not merely for saving me from that mountain danger, but for the man you have proven yourself to be through every choice since, gentle with frightened creatures and fierce against injustice both. I love you as well, Helen Lawson, for your courage and your careful mind, and your refusal to accept comfortable lies when difficult truths demanded acknowledgement. I have found, through knowing you, that the peace my father taught me to value was merely a smaller shadow of the peace available through genuine partnership, and I intend to spend the rest of my years proving that lesson correct. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at Fairhaven's modest church, attended by Pratt, who had traveled down from Discovery Creek specifically for the occasion, and by several of the district's merchants and settlers, who had come to respect both Helen's business acumen and Caleb's practical skill during the weeks following Tanner's exposure. Judge Cole himself attended, having grown genuinely fond of the couple whose courage had helped expose corruption he had suspected but lacked evidence to pursue, and he offered a toast at their small celebration that spoke of justice served and love found in equal measure. The homestead they built together over the following months grew to include not merely Caleb's original horse corrals, but a proper distilling operation as well, run according to honest principles that Helen's careful accounting ensured remained transparent and fair to every supplier and customer alike. Pratt eventually joined them as head distiller, having found in their honest partnership the kind of security and respect that Tanner's operation had never truly offered, and word of their fair dealing and quality product spread throughout the district, ensuring their small enterprise prospered through legitimate means rather than the manufactured crisis and corruption that had characterized Tanner's approach. On evenings when the day's work was finished, horses settled and mash properly tended, Helen and Caleb often sat together on the porch Caleb had built specifically for such moments, watching sunset paint the mountains that had first brought them together through danger and discovery both. Their love had grown not from a single dramatic rescue, but from countless moments of mutual reliance and respect, each of them saving the other in different ways, Caleb's gentle strength protecting Helen through physical danger, while her sharp mind and moral courage had saved him from the isolation that had defined his previous years, teaching him that trust properly placed created strength rather than vulnerability. Do you ever miss the solitude? Helen asked one such evening, watching the last light fade behind the western peaks. I have found something better than solitude, Caleb answered, drawing her closer against his side with an arm whose considerable strength had never once been used against her, only ever in her protection and support. I have found partnership, Helen, the kind my father never taught me to value because he had perhaps never experienced it himself. I would not trade this life we have built, this home, this work, this love we have proven through genuine trial, for any amount of the peaceful loneliness I once believed sufficient. Nor would I trade it, Helen said, for any amount of the careful, guarded survival I once believed was the best I could hope for after watching trust betrayed so thoroughly. You have taught me, Caleb Wells, that trust placed wisely creates exactly the strength you describe, and I find myself grateful daily for the mountain that brought us together, treacherous as its false thaw proved to be. They remained there together as full darkness settled over the mountains, two people who had found in each other not merely romantic love but genuine partnership, built through shared danger and honest struggle rather than convenient circumstance. A love that had proven itself through fire and flood and public confrontation with corruption, and that promised, in the quiet comfort of their shared home, to continue proving itself through all the ordinary days that honest partnership and chosen love could offer two people brave enough to trust what they had found in each other. The still they tended together continued producing honest whiskey through that spring and into summer, while Caleb's horses, gentled by his patient hands, and now often assisted by Helen's own growing skill with frightened animals, found buyers throughout the district who valued quality and fair dealing above the manufactured urgency that had once characterized Tanner's now dismantled empire. Their home, built on the foundation of that first desperate night spent repairing sabotaged copper before dawn, stood as testament to what patient work and honest love could accomplish even against considerable odds, a partnership that had begun with a wrecked coach and a stranded distiller, and had grown, through mutual courage and genuine trust, into exactly the kind of chosen family that neither of them had believed themselves capable of building before fate, and a false winter thaw, had brought them together on that treacherous mountain road.